All right, welcome everyone to today's session where we're going to talk about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, all under the overarching theme of fostering professional resilience. So I'm Erin Beckwell, and I'm a social worker who works as a knowledge translation specialist in population public health in the Saskatchewan Health Authority. And so my work includes focus on all sorts of activities and strategies that improve access to health and outcomes in health, particularly for the most vulnerable, oppressed, or marginalized folks, but also looking at how do we shift the culture of our health system to provide a better place to work and to be more accessible for a wider range of workers. And so one of the things that I've started doing as an extension of a conversation on trauma-informed care in our practice is looking at how do we better support staff as they navigate the realities of their work life. And of course, within mental health, we've known for a long time that workers in this area are exposed to lots of trauma. And so vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue are probably not new ideas, but wanted to take this opportunity to just sort of dive a little bit into that, hopefully provide some tools that will give you a bit of a sense of what you can do moving forward, or maybe some new ways to frame your experience. So for the next little bit here, we'll go through a bit of sort of basic content, but then get fairly quickly into some of the tools and other pieces of strategy that might be helpful in your practice and in your personal life as well. So before we get into that, though, I want to start by setting the tone for this being trauma-informed space. And even though we're in virtual space, I think it's really crucial to check in with yourself and use whatever strategies you need to stay grounded, to self-assess or monitor. And ultimately, the beautiful thing about virtual sessions like this is you have even more choice and control or easier access to those things than you might in an in-person session. So it's okay to pause, take a break, maybe come back to this another day if this isn't going well for you today, or if it's bringing up things that you're not in a position to deal with, especially if you're at work. But stay connected to those resources, or use whatever wellness kits, sensory wellness, or other approaches that help you. One of the things that I really focus on when I talk about this stuff is that when we talk about trauma, when we talk about burnout and the stress of the work, I mean, so often we're talking about distress, we're talking about the people we support. And the reality is not only are workers in these areas, but I would say in most areas of healthcare, we're exposed to the stress of others and certainly at risk of being traumatized ourselves or experiencing our own distress because of that. But we also come into the work with our own trauma stories, and those may be completely unrelated to our chosen profession or the work setting in which we do social work or psychology or addictions counseling or any number of other roles that we play in the health system. And so when we think about our personal trauma stories, those certainly can be a part of what makes us really good at what we do. They can also be certainly a challenge or an additional layer of complexity in terms of managing the impact of the work, and that can be ongoing, but it can also be in particular moments that are very difficult. So I just sort of like to set that tone that this isn't just about how exposure to other people's difficult stories impacts us. We also carry those stories in ourselves often. And certainly some of the research that's been done shows that for people who work in helping professions in general, have a higher than average rate of trauma exposure in their lifetime. And so there's a lot of theories about why that is, but certainly has heightened my awareness of the need to just create a space where we can be open about that, or at least acknowledge that that's part of what many of us bring with us to work every single day. So the main question that drives this talk is thinking about the impact of our work on our emotional well-being. And so we often pay an emotional price for doing the work we do, especially if we're doing it in a very relational way And I would say so much of what we do in mental health is very much focused on that relational approach where we're perhaps a bit emotional, vulnerable ourselves. We also then hopefully are building rapport and creating a sense of safety with folks, which means we hear difficult stories and therefore are either directly or indirectly exposed to that type of traumatic experience. The other piece of our work is that we don't often get to see the positive outcome for people who come through our system. And so that may be we see some improvement in some areas of life, but we also often have a really acute awareness that the folks we're supporting are facing challenges on multiple layers, and they're navigating systems that aren't well equipped to support them. So our ability to see, really clear change or really clear success in our work may be impacted by all of those other factors. That means we don't always get to see, oh, it was worth it, right? All the tough parts of the work, the tough moments when this person got really vulnerable and shared a story, or when I maybe became a bit vulnerable myself to make a connection and help facilitate that process, that we don't always get that immediate sense, and sometimes we don't get it at all, that it was worth it, that there was the ending was worth the means to get there and all the hard work that happens, which means that we can be particularly vulnerable. And if we combine this with the reality that many of us do come into the work and bring with us our trauma stories, this certainly creates a risk for us in terms of trauma exposure. And so, not surprisingly, compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are both common in all sorts of health and human service settings. And of course, lots of factors dictating when these experiences show up or when the work reaches a point where it impacts us negatively. So thinking about what this looks like, I mean, many of us have a sense of what burnout might feel like, or maybe even what compassion fatigue feels like. For some, we've had a very clear experience that we can name around vicarious trauma. But for those of us who may be like, I don't know, what was that? Was it just a bad month, or was it something else? And here's some questions that can help sort of get a sense of where you're at. So looking at everything from that disruptive image piece around, do you have thoughts, intrusive memories or intrusive thoughts? Do you have a hard time shaking the really tough stories when maybe that hasn't always been the case? Perhaps you're having nightmares. Maybe you're just emotionally exhausted and having a hard time sort of tapping into your emotional reserves to engage with folks. And maybe that actually isn't coming out in your work, it's coming out at home with your partner, your kids, your neighbor, somebody on the freeway in front of you who's not driving quick enough, and usually you'd be quite compassionate, and perhaps you just find yourself feeling quite impatient or drained. But really the hallmark of compassion fatigue is this sense of emotional exhaustion, like I just don't have the energy to care. And that can certainly kind of fester into something more intense and more deep-rooted for folks. But typically that sense of, it's taking everything I've got just to, summon up some emotional engagement for this, client or group or whatever type of work you're doing, is a real hallmark of that compassion fatigue. And the other piece I'll just highlight here, though, is there's a couple of questions about changes in empathy and change in worldview, and those aren't necessarily just about compassion fatigue. That's sort of when we're verging into that vicarious trauma, is that change in worldview. So if you typically think all people have potential for change, or people possess some inherent goodness as humans or worth as humans, and you're really struggling to see that anymore. And so that can be very common in folks who work in areas like intimate partner violence. It can also be challenging in areas where you're hearing a lot of really tough stuff. So if you're working with people who've experienced sexual violence, people who have experienced developmental types of abuse, have attachment-related trauma, those types of things, certainly one story is often okay, you can handle it. It's the cumulative impact of all of those stories over the course of days, weeks, months, years, right, that starts to wear on us. And unless we have an outlet for the emotional impact of that, the neurological impact of those things, we may end up triggering past trauma or adding on a new layer of trauma experience. And it can show up in some pretty profound ways that are quite noticeable, especially around, notable changes in worldview and very noticeable decreased empathy. So I wanted to start by talking about burnout, and burnout is certainly quite common. It's a gradual depletion or exhaustion of a person's resources, whether those are mental, physical, emotional, and it's often about prolonged attempts at striving towards expectations that are unrealistic. Those expectations can be unrealistic because we set unrealistic expectations of ourselves. So, maybe we have a bit of a perfectionist streak, or, just hold ourselves to a very, very high standard that we may know on some level is unattainable, but we strive for that nonetheless. The other piece that can be setting these unrealistic expectations is our system, our employment, our employer, our workplace. And so looking at the volume of people we see, reducing sometimes very complex matters to very simple problems, those types of expectations that can be quite challenging, or to do more with less. And I hear a lot of that in the system as well, and I've experienced that in my own work, that this idea that we need to just keep doing more, seeing more people faster. However, often we're not filling vacant positions, or dealing with increased volume of clients without increased numbers of staff, and so that stress goes somewhere. And so often what we see with burnout is people's capacity to deal with the demands of life. That can be work life or personal life, or both. Often a sense of powerlessness, like there's no point, it doesn't matter what I do, it doesn't make a difference. And that may be about making change or reaching goals or controlling your work. So people may start to, for lack of a better word, take on what may look like quite a victim stance in that powerlessness. And people's worldview typically doesn't change. It's just their hopefulness and their sense of power to, sort of live out a worldview is impacted. And it can happen, burnout can happen to anyone in any occupation. It can happen to someone who drives a cab. It can happen to, someone who's doing repetitive work, like in a manufacturing setting. It's not necessarily linked to trauma. It's linked to that dissonance between expectation of reality, and in a sustained way. So we all have moments where the expectation doesn't meet reality, or reality doesn't meet expectations. That happens to all of us on occasion. But if that's kind of the state of someone's work world for prolonged periods of time, you will start to see in most people this gradual depletion or exhaustion. And it's certainly something people can recover from. Often with burnout, the antidote is take time away from work. So people take vacation, maybe take a leave of absence, but may switch jobs, and often notice a shift, at least temporarily, in how they feel and how they approach their work. So burnout happens to many people. I would say almost all workers at some point have some version of burnout. And for some people, they may find, because, who particularly focused on a standard that's unattainable, or work in a very complex workplace that's inadequately resourced, or, to have very high expectations of workers, you may be more susceptible to burnout more often, and need to then take steps to address that susceptibility, which is where sort of focus on resilience comes in. So then when we talk about vicarious trauma, often people see these things as related, and in reality, most of the literature says trauma is a separate thing from burnout and compassion fatigue. So vicarious trauma is that process over time where the sense impacts all areas of our life often, although maybe more apparent in some. So some people get really intense physical symptoms, much like any trauma experience, right? Maybe it shows up in terms of physical pain, other types of physical distress or discomfort may show up emotionally, relationally, all sorts of areas are impacted, but often in some way, shape, or form it impacts our perception of ourselves in relation to the world and our general worldview. And so that worldview becomes altered in some way, and that can be temporary, but if this experience of trauma continues and deepens and intensifies, that relationship with the worldview will continue to alter. And so people may have this sense that, you know, my work gives me meaning, might be a critical part of how we view the world. And people may become gradually disenchanted with their work and have a decreased sense of hope, optimism, belief in the goodness of people, the inherent value or dignity of people, those types of things. And so you may start noticing a change in behavior because of that. And so these are profound changes. They may not, even though they're often gradual or cumulative, it's not necessarily true, though, that the impact is seen gradually. People may notice a very radical change very quickly. Or it may be that colleagues, friends, family notice the shift happening gradually, but it's often only when very significant shifts start to happen that people begin to talk about it or name it or perhaps even ask the person to change their behavior or take a break from work or both. And so this is about our need to bring empathy to our work, our need to be emotionally vulnerable in our work, and how that creates a vulnerability, because then we're perhaps, and you know, unless we have really good supports and really good coping mechanisms ourselves that we have access to on a regular basis, we may then be impacted by the traumatic experiences of others. So when we're thinking of vicarious trauma, one of the most helpful framing of that experience is, you know, it's not necessarily about the worst story you've ever heard, most difficult. It's all the thousands or hundreds or even dozens of stories. Maybe some of them we don't even remember hearing, or they blur together, or they seemed inconsequential at the time, or perhaps just not noteworthy. And so the question is, where do those stories go at the end of your day? That we often know to debrief the really intense stuff, the really significant moments or stories or experiences we have. We have protocol for that. We have, you know, others notice. So the example I've been using lately, of course, is the bus crash, that it was a significant event, that people were able to realize the workers in those situations, whether they were first responders, you know, police, fire, ambulance drivers, all the way to hospital staff and others, would be impacted by that. So it was normalized, it was talked about openly, there were resources put in place to support people, there was a process for debriefing. Was it perfect? No. But it was a discrete event that people could look at and say, on this date this happened, and then the subsequent followed from that impacted people, and they will continue to be impacted. The challenge with compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, is that we experience things that can create a similar or sometimes even more difficult response to sort of cope with almost every day in our work. And we don't have that same culture around it where it's normalized to talk about the impact of that. We validate people's experience. We provide particular supports. because it's not as easy to point to it and say, oh, that happened there, and therefore I have this response. Certainly our everyday work exposes us to trauma, exposes us to struggle, exposes us to pain, also exposes us to brilliance and resilience, and all sorts of examples of how wonderful people can be and how strong people can be, including ourselves. However, it's that gradual creep of all of those really tough moments that sometimes, especially if we aren't able to balance it out with the good moments, but also the good moments outside of our work, that we can really struggle to manage the impact of it. So this idea that in order to do our work well, we often are required to become emotionally vulnerable to some extent, and that looks different in different settings, but we may, need to engage in a bit of self-disclosure or, connect with people in a way that invites them into disclose or share or be vulnerable themselves. But doing that also then increases our risk of vicarious trauma, as well as compassion fatigue and burnout. So certainly the more your practice style and context sort of flows into this place of emotional vulnerability, the more you need to be very, very mindful of the impact of vicarious trauma, the potential for that to happen, but also the potential for compassion fatigue and burnout as well. So one of the things to think about, of course, is we are all surrounded, I think, by workers who've experienced trauma outside of the workplace, but also within the workplace. And if we don't attend to this as part of what we do every day in our workplace, we will be impacted in our ability to learn, our ability to be reflective, our ability to problem solve, deal with change. And of course, in recent months and years, we've all dealt with so much change in our workplace that there's still so many unanswered questions for many of us, that if we're dealing with acute impacts of trauma or compassion fatigue to some extent, our capacity to manage that type of ongoing long-term change, especially when so many aspects of our work life are impacted by that change, it will be increasingly difficult for us to navigate that on a long-term basis. So we may become impatient or anxious or suspicious. Like, there's all sorts of ways this can show up, and certainly that will impact our relationships, whether that's with colleagues, our supervisors, the director, maybe just with the system in which we work. It could be our relationships also, though, with our family, friends, and in relationships outside of work. So trauma doesn't necessarily, stay nice and neat and tidy and contained at work, so we can keep it from impacting the rest of our world. So Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, and I'll provide a link at the end of the slides to a TED Talk she does and to her Trauma Stewardship Institute. But she has done some really interesting work on how trauma affects workers, and she's a psychologist who's been impacted by vicarious trauma, and shares very candidly how those experiences have happened for her. So I really encourage you to check out her video. But this is the model she uses, and it really shows how the impact of trauma exposure can result in a wide range of responses. And I think we might know that if we've taken some training on trauma. We often are applying this information to folks we're supporting, maybe even doing some psychoeducational work in terms of communicating to the people we support, this is how these experiences affect the way we cope, the way we relate, the way we move through the world. We might not do as good a job at actually turning that back on ourselves and saying, how is exposure to trauma as a part of my daily work potentially impacting me? And so doing a quick scan to see, am I engaging in some hypervigilance? Is my creativity been affected? Am I using drugs or alcohol to cope more than I have in the past? And is that potentially problematic? do I maybe have an overwhelming sense of fear, or maybe it's just this underlying current of fear, anxiety, maybe I'm becoming really cynical. And certainly, one of the things that I've experienced is I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, I would say, most of the time. But when I'm really struggling with work and what I've heard and seen, and even though I don't do direct practice anymore, I often have staff members sharing their stories with me, and very rarely do I have the influence or the opportunity to do much to make that better. And I've realized over the course of doing this work that that can actually result in some of these types of impacts on me. I sort of was under the assumption that, I don't do direct counseling anymore, so I'm okay. I won't have this happen to me anymore. And the reality is it still sneaks up on you, because I hear some pretty intense, pretty disturbing stories about what people are experiencing in their workplace, and sometimes some pretty depressing stories about our workplace's failure to actually support folks and respond appropriately, and what that has done to people who, work in areas like mental health. And so one of the things I've noticed in myself is I become increasingly cynical, where I become quite hopeless. Well, the system is not going to change anyway. That person probably has some kind of ulterior motive, so we can't trust that, they just are in it for the right reasons, because I've heard of so many people who are in it for the wrong reasons. And I start to get quite skewed in terms of how I see myself in relation to the work and in relation to the broad system that I work for. And it's interesting, because my direct supervisor notices almost immediately, and we have a really great relationship where she's able to actually be quite open in talking to me about these things. And we've talked about how these are related to my previous workplace exposure to trauma, but also some of my other trauma experiences I've had outside of work, and what I need to be supported by her, her as my manager, which I've realized is a huge privilege that most people don't have. But that's one of those pieces, is sort of walking through, where are you at? Do you find it's harder and harder to focus and concentrate? Have you brushed that off as, I just got a lot on my mind? Or perhaps are you having some dissociative moments in the middle of a group or a session or a meeting? And what could that be about? Maybe it's this sense that, if I left this place, it would all fall apart. That, inflated sense of importance, and therefore I can't take a day off, I can't go work anywhere else, I can't take a leave of absence, I can't go back to school, those types of things. And so any of these things just on their own is certainly could be challenging, but it's when we start seeing multiple signs of a trauma exposure response that may be an indicator that there's really some work that needs to be done, or some support that's needed there. And of course, our coping patterns from other situations that are stressful or traumatizing are likely to show up again, right? So if we tend to cope by through things like hypervigilance or dissociation, we may find that those things start showing up again, maybe while we're at work and maybe not, but if we start following those back, the root may be some of the things we've experienced or heard about through our work. You're also likely quite familiar with, what it looks like when people are stressed, and so this is an example of people aren't finding an outlet for that traumatic type stress, and so we experience something that triggers us, or we experience a trauma. In most of our work, maybe we're hearing trauma, or maybe even bearing witness to some extent, depending on the context. And so then if we aren't emotionally well-regulated and we become dysregulated, we can easily fall into those types of trauma responses that were on the previous slide, and we may end up, if we're not able to emotionally regulate, in that kind of ping pong, bouncing back and forth type of response, or we get stuck on where, our sympathetic nervous system is, over activated and we can't settle. Maybe we get stuck off and we're sort of in that depressed, flat affect, kind of low, and we're struggling to bring ourselves back up to that kind of normal wave. And so, this is certainly just a good reminder that we may think of how this applies to the people we support if we're doing direct support work, but we may not have thought ever or for a while about how it applies to our lives and how this may be showing up in our office mate across the hall or our co-facilitator in a group or even in our supervisor or in ourselves. And how can we then build in practices that allow us to be more aware of this, but also to gently and compassionately raise these questions, from a place of curiosity and wanting to support our colleagues. And, I've noticed this. Are you okay? Is there anything you need? What would help? And especially if we're in a supervisory role, these things can be really critical. So we know, of course, that a lot of people have some patterns of trauma response in terms of how they end up coping. And so when people are exposed to vicarious trauma, so they're experiencing that trauma response, if you have a historic pattern of how you tend to respond, it's likely to continue for the most part. Some people bounce all over from these groups. Others certainly have a very clear pattern of responses that fall into a category. So, the sort of long ago we would talk about fight or flight. We now know it's more nuanced than that. And my guess, if I had to look ahead into where the literature will go on this, is that we may see, two forms of trauma response that became 3, that became 4, continue to evolve and become more subtle and less, sort of specific as we understand that trauma looks like a lot of things that we didn't really understand were trauma. And so the piece that some people might not have heard of is the flop or fawn response. And those are folks who may be quite permissive or submissive. They can also, though, be very charming and persuasive. And one of the ways I describe that group of folks, so much like people in the fight response, they will use aggression, hostility, anger, defensiveness to try to maintain a sense of safety in their world. Folks with a flight response, they leave or shut down, so numb out or avoid things as a way to try to create a sense of return to safety. People freeze, so they shut down, or maybe literally can't move depending on the situation. Perhaps they dissociate or disconnect. Maybe they have a bit of that flat affect. And then there's, a group of people that I've heard described as high-functioning trauma responders. I don't love that language at all. But this idea that these folks find safety or maintain safety by attempting to attend to or influence the emotional state of others. And so rather than fighting your way out or leaving or shutting down, I'm going to try to massage, manipulate, influence the room, the people in my world. And if they're okay or they're the way I need them to be, then I'm okay. And so it's a very interesting way of responding to trauma that there's some theories that this is where you see people who can be really good, like motivational speakers or salespeople. And so people can, of course, use any of these ways of responding to trauma in ways that are seen as good or helpful, positive. There's all sorts of, there's, two sides to this coin in particular, where these things can be harmful and detrimental and certainly very challenging to navigate, but they can also be, I had one person I supported who described these things as their superpower, that this is what helps them be resilient, was they'd adapted and developed these strategies, and workers do it too, right? So there's a few tools that you can check out to really do a bit more of a deep dive around balance, and that in particular will be helpful in looking at things like compassion, fatigue, and burnout. Looking at self-care doesn't necessarily help us directly with vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is not about how well you do self-care, right? If your body experiences something as traumatic, directly or indirectly, it'll experience a trauma response of some sort. That might not happen in the immediate moment. It might happen far down the road. But self-care and self-compassion can be very helpful in allowing us to have space to navigate trauma, allowing us to take time, being gentle with ourselves and such. Self-care, though, doesn't prevent vicarious trauma from happening. So just a reminder that it's kind of like, well, if I'd have done self-care better, I wouldn't have experienced this trauma response from my work. It's much like that sort of blame the victim mentality that we sometimes see with other forms of traumatic experiences, abuse in particular. And so being really, really mindful of that yes, caring for ourselves and maintaining a sense of balance is really important for our well-being, but it's not preventing us from experiencing a trauma response from our work. And so just be gentle with yourselves. So I encourage everyone to do some sort of check-in occasionally to see how well am I doing in terms of balance in my life. And so there's two tools on this slide. The ProQual is a scientifically validated tool that's kind of complicated. But if you like math, I'm a social worker, don't like math, you might like this, that it's a much more, it gives you a score, and some people like that stuff, right? The self-care assessment is a much less structured way of looking at how well we are attending to different areas of our lives. So if you're more into that, you can also take a peek at both of them and see which one works for you, see if there's any difference in the responses or those sorts of things. But it's really helpful, I think, to have these tools to assist us and guide us as we go through that type of reflection. And often if we just do a quick check-in with ourselves, we may miss things or overemphasize particular things. Sometimes those things are things we do well, and sometimes they're things we're struggling with. We may miss a whole bunch of other contexts and not see gaps in our self-care or realize that we're actually doing better than we thought. So these types of assessment tools can be quite helpful for that. So this is actually my favorite quote about compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, and it's not new, 1996. So these thoughts and this dialogue has been happening for a long, long time, decades, generations, even before it was showing up in our professional and scientific literature. This was part of the conversation. It might not have been a part of workplaces necessarily or mainstream, but it's certainly not new. So this idea that we immerse ourselves in suffering and loss every day by virtue of the work we often do, and that it is unrealistic to expect that will not affect us. And the sort of comparison being made here is that, expecting to be able to walk through water and not get wet, that this is natural and expected, predictable outcome, right? So I think often there's this sense that the impact, especially negative, is a sign that that individual worker, that individual person isn't doing something right, that they aren't coping well enough, they're not tough enough, they're not resilient enough. They're doing something or missing something that is contributing. And in some cases, of course, we get really out of balance and it does impact our ability to be resilient in the work. But more often than not, we are stepping into spaces that are absolutely full of trauma. So I can call those trauma-saturated environments where not only are most of the folks coming in the door bringing with them a trauma story or dozens of trauma stories, we are also working alongside colleagues and often ourselves who have trauma ourselves, and then we're exposed to trauma as workers. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer of trauma. And we also have to acknowledge that we live in communities that are often traumatized communities, particularly people who are Indigenous or who, are in communities that have been profoundly impacted by tragic events, but especially if those events are very widespread. So I'm thinking 60 Scoop residential school, where we have not only an individual experience of trauma, but a collective experience of trauma. Those ingredients, those experiences tend to combine to intensify or add a layer of complexity to the experience of trauma for those people, but also often for the workers in those communities as well, which can make this experience all the more challenging to navigate. So when we talk about compassion fatigue particularly, I think there's a sense that, again, this is a disorder, this is a problem. The reality is it's an occupational hazard. So I advocate very strongly this should be an occupational health and safety issue, that this is part of the context of doing our work. It happens when we do our work well. It is not a sign we are working poorly or sloppily or not following some kind of process or protocol. It happens, and it is something that we need to do better as a system in acknowledging and attending to and creating space for folks to share stories or access support, and even to just name it as a system. And I think that would be a really critical move. And so when we look at what it looks like, I mean, yeah, it's that exhaustion, but can show up in ways that are more concrete, like people are sick a lot, they miss a lot of work. That can be a sign of apathy. It can also be from avoidance. It can be folks using one of the only tools our system provides for workers to address compassion fatigue is the sick day, right? Yet then when we go to our, visibility walls and we hear about the, high use of sick time and that we want to bring that down, we don't provide a lot of other tools for people as a system, and so people will use what they can access. What happens, though, when people use sick time or, their ability to detach from the work however they can, it can impact teams. It can impact the quality of care we provide, and it can impact the morale on a team as well. If people are concerned, well, is this person even going to show up today? Are we going to have to cover for them? Is there going to be, how is that impacting wait times? There's all sorts of layers. And often then that person, in addition to using, sick time in a way, to address their experience of compassion fatigue, which may or may not be actually helpful, they may also be experiencing guilt or shame because they may think, I'm not actually sick, I'm letting people down, everybody's going to hate me now because I don't show up, and it can actually snowball that experience into something more intense. People can also head to a place where they get, cynical, irritable, edgy, that, maybe they silence other people or have no patience for people of other perspectives or who are expressing their experience in different ways. I worked in a workplace where a colleague was dealing with what I now understand to be quite likely compassion fatigue. She was really teary a lot. Everything seemed to evoke tears. And thankfully, most of the time, not with clients, but in the staff room, at staff meetings in particular, there was often a lot of tears. And she was very apologetic. I'm sorry, I'm so weepy. I can't contain it anymore. And another colleague who I also understand is now also experiencing compassion fatigue was so frustrated with her. Well, if you want to do this work, you need to have a thicker skin than that. Like, I can't sit here and listen to you cry all day. And this real, irritability, and then attempts to engage other colleagues in sort of sidebar conversations about this person. And so that was then affecting everyone else in that team, right? Where people are like, I don't know what to do. How do we deal with this? And thankfully, in the immediate, how that situation was resolved is one of those staff members moved on. But I've often wondered, did they move on to a place where they developed a similar, sort of experience of compassion fatigue, and was the response better, regardless of which one of those colleagues of mine moved on, right? The one that was irritable or the one that was sad. And I think she had really clear signs of depression, but looking deeper into it, it was very much related to our work. So when we think about self-care, one of the things I've always struggled with in my social work career is the conversation about self-care tended to focus on individual things we were supposed to do, right? And the narrative was, do these things, prevent the bad stuff, prevent the burnout, usually, and we didn't talk a lot about compassion fatigue back in the day. But there was this idea that if we did the right things, we would be resilient. We would not have a negative effect from our work. And so for myself and so many of my colleagues and so many people that have approached me in the system in recent years, it's clear that sometimes even when you do all the right things, bad things still happen. And it can actually make that experience even more challenging to navigate because there's this sense of, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? And that can compound people's sense of hopelessness or despair or anger or frustration or irritability, is that sense that, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me that this happened? And there can be sometimes a subtle, sometimes less subtle sense of judgment from systems that ask questions, perhaps not exactly like that, but that allude to that sense, right? That if we do self-care right or well, that we will be okay. The reality is, my experience in doing this work has led me to a place where I think, what if we just assumed that if we are stepping into work where there's a very high likelihood that we're going to experience compassion fatigue, burnout, perhaps vicarious trauma as well? What if these are predictable outcomes of doing work that's hard in ways that are often very emotionally vulnerable, in a workforce where lots of us have trauma histories, which adds to our vulnerability? So what if we took a harm reduction approach rather than an abstinence-based approach? So let's just prevent all of it and nobody gets, it's like, oh, people are going to struggle. Tough stuff's going to happen. We're going to be affected. How do we prevent that from being catastrophic? Whether that's catastrophic or harmful to ourselves, to the people we're here to support, to our clients, to our colleagues, to our employer, to the community, and what would that look like? So I played around a little bit with a model, and this model came about from sitting on the boat a couple summers ago, watching my young niece and nephew learn to water ski for the first time. And there was my brother-in-law having a lovely chat with them and explaining that, okay, you're going to fall. It's going to happen, happens to all of us. So let's talk about how you keep yourself safe if you're going to fall down. And so there was talk about safety gear. You got your life jacket on, things to do, let go of the rope, don't let yourself be dragged, don't be worried about being embarrassed, because this happens to all of us when we're learning, and a real emphasis on we're learning always. And, my brother-in-law was like, sometimes I still bite it. You guys have seen me fall. He made a joke to my little nephew about, don't worry about losing your trunks. We won't laugh at you too hard. And I was sitting there, and of course I'm such a nerd that I'm thinking about, what if we approached our work this way? What if we talked to, and I teach social work students, so I'm thinking, what if I'm teaching students that this is how this can happen? We will fall. And it'll look different for different people. It'll happen at different times in our career. The frequency may be different, but that it's normal. It happens. It's predictable, and that we're all learning at any point in our career. We're still learning about ourselves. We're learning about the work. We're learning about our workplace, our clientele. So how do we adapt that sort of thinking to thinking about burnout, compassion fatigue, and trauma? So how do we help people check in and think about, what's my safety gear? What's my life jacket or my parachute? Whatever visual works for you. What are the things that can help prevent, and also acknowledge that there's a risk there, right? So are there strategies or things you can put in place? One of the things that I've learned is some of my safety gear. I have a really good relationship with my supervisor, and I have a counselor. I don't see him all the time. See him maybe once every 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes not even that. But I have people who I trust and feel safe with good relationships, and who can say things to me and I can hear it most of the time. And so that for me has been part of my safety gear. Other part of my safety gear, I took my email off my phone. So my work isn't following me quite as much as it used to, which really does help me manage compassion fatigue and burnout. So then the next piece is, what's your early warning system? What are the signs that you might be struggling? For me, one of the first signs is I quit taking breaks. So I work right through my breaks. Maybe I eat lunch at my desk. Then I don't eat lunch at all. And this is a pattern that has followed me for a long, long time in my life. So I know when it starts to show up again, I'm not coping well. So I start asking myself, what's that about? Is it that I'm really stressed outside of work? Maybe it's following me, right? Maybe it's that work is really stressful and I have this sense of unrealistic expectations that I'm striving to meet, which means I work through my breaks and I work through lunch, or maybe I work longer hours. Maybe I'm taking work home with me, those types of signs. For you, it might be very different. Maybe you love getting out and going for a walk every day, and it's part of your self-care that helps you feel in your body and balanced, and it's maybe how you decompress. Maybe you quit doing that, and that's a sign. What's going on? That something you love that benefits you so much, you sort of let that go. Then the piece that I think is really fascinating is, if we're going to fall, how do we fall well, right? How do we minimize harm to ourselves and others when we fall, when we burn out, when we experience compassion fatigue? So that may be noticing sooner. For me, every experience I've had of burnout, the learning from that is, how could I have seen that coming sooner? So that it didn't get so bad before somebody did something or I did something to try to shift things. And so it could be, how do I access support as soon as possible? How do I contain the impact? So really thinking about your unique circumstance and what that would look like. Then the next piece that I think is really interesting, early in my career, I had a really intense experience of burnout. It was kind of embarrassing because I did not fall well. I fell in probably the most ungraceful, undignified, and kind of shameful way I could imagine at the time. And so for me, the question of, how do I actually get back up again? How do I come back to work? How do I return to this work that I love so much, that I thought I was made for, but that I struggled to do well so early in my career? How do I maintain my dignity? And how do I face some really tough questions, like, do I need to change jobs? Do I need a break? How do I navigate those things when I maybe have responsibilities? And at that point in my life, I was like, I can't take a break. I have student loans to pay off, and barely making much money, not enough sometimes to pay my student loans. So I can't just not work. So there's nothing else I can do, was sort of the approach I had taken, was there's nothing else. This is just what it's like, then I have to just suck it up and deal. And all of those things contributed to this pretty catastrophic, almost career-limiting experience of burnout. And so then the question was, how do I walk back into that workplace or have a conversation with that colleague who I worry maybe doesn't respect me much, or, apologize to people or make a plan. So this merges into that moving forward. How do I move forward in a way that allows me to seek and accept for support when I need it? Because quite often, part of people's story of burnout or compassion fatigue, or trauma for that matter, is that sense that we can handle it on our own. This is something I maybe can't tell other people is happening, or I'm not sure what it is, or I'm afraid of what it is. Maybe we're afraid this might mean we can't do work that we love or work we've trained for years to do, or we can't see ourselves doing anything else, so we just don't know what else to do. So certainly figuring out how do I move forward in a way that I can plug into my support network earlier and more consistently to help me stay well and to help me sort of weather the next storm, I think can be really useful. And the other, I think, interesting approach to this is that this is not a linear step model, right? This is a cycle, keeps going, that we will all have these experiences. Some of them are going to be more intense, less intense, and we will learn about ourselves, we'll learn about our practice, we'll learn about what we need and how to ask for that. We'll learn about what supports suit us best at different times of life, and we'll be able to incorporate that new insight and awareness into future iterations. Does this mean that, everyone should just be planning to burn out all the time? No. So we may find that the lag between elements of this is longer or shorter, depending on what's happening for us in life. But certainly, I think for most people, the experience is that to some extent we experience, I have a friend who calls it mini burnout, which is maybe less profound or impactful than full-on burnout. I don't know. But however we conceive of these things, the reality is we are always experiencing some kind of ebb and flow of our emotional energy, of our mental capacity. All of these things are not static, and so we are very likely to have things happening in our work and our personal life that influences how we move through our work day, and part of that is going to be what are the stories coming at us and what support do we have in our workplace to actually manage the impact of that. So one of the most interesting things is when we look at what can we do for self-care, one of the best, most evidence-based self-care strategies is emotional regulation. And it's, I would say, one of the things we don't talk about much in our training to do helping kind of work, and is one that I don't get a lot of requests to talk about emotional regulation for service providers, but it's certainly essential when we're with folks who are dysregulated. If we aren't coping well, if we aren't using all those things we can use to keep us well and balanced and grounded, we can get swept up into that sort of flurry of dysregulation. And so we need to figure out how to stay connected to our capacity for emotional regulation. And for some of us, that might mean we have to do some learning or some work on ourselves. To really sort out what's the stuff that triggers me, what do I tend to get swept up into easily, and that isn't just client stuff, it can be coworker stuff. If you have coworkers who are not well emotionally regulated, likelihood of you becoming dysregulated is much higher, right? Unless you're aware and able to access whatever resources you need, internal or external, to cope. The other thing I'll just highlight as we wrap up is often one of the ways we cope with the difficulty of our workplace is we share the tough stuff with our colleagues, which is beautiful if you think about it. We often, though, also may be spreading around compassion fatigue or trauma by sharing really difficult stuff with our colleagues who are already dealing with their own difficult stuff. And so there's a new school of thought that talks about this as sliming. Are you sliming your colleagues? Are we gradually just spreading around this trauma in our workplaces? Are we being slimed by others? And I think these are really important questions. So the idea is that we can often not eradicate slime completely, but we can slow it down. And so we can be more self-aware. We can give people fair warning, a heads up, be like, hey, I'm having a really brutal day. Are you cool with a talk, or would you rather talk about the weather? And then that's the consent piece, right? Giving people the opportunity to say yes or no. So a lot of this is actually very, very rooted in trauma-informed principles, right? This idea that people need choice, they need to consent, they need to be in control as much as possible, which is going to help people be resilient in the face of a trauma-saturated workplace. Then if we do get the invitation or the consent to share, that we do what's called low-impact disclosure. So we're not sharing all the nitty-gritty details. We're focused on how did it affect me. So we're not resharing someone's story, which also can potentially be violating privacy and confidentiality, but we're sharing how did hearing a really tough story impact us. Because most often, that's the piece that our colleagues care about, right, is they want to make sure we're okay with it. And so we can do that in a way that doesn't just, well, let me tell you what I heard this morning. You won't believe it. It was horrifying. And so that approach tends to just pass it on, right, and share the impact of it with others, rather than that sense of, I just heard some really tough stuff. I don't really know how I'm going to sit through an afternoon of clients after what I heard this morning. And that's about me and how I'm doing with it, which there's also something others can usually do, whether it's listen, ask what we need, maybe like, hey, would going for a walk at lunch help? Do you want to order noodle bowls? Whatever it is they know maybe is one of those self-care activities that might help us get through the rest of the day. So the questions I ask folks to think about as we wrap up is, what are you already doing really well? Odds are you are already engaging in some strategies to cope. Some of those may be very clearly self-care oriented or self-compassion oriented. Some of them may be about, if things get rough, if I get triggered, if the conversation's really intense, if it's been a rough week, how do I stay grounded? How do I discharge some of that emotional stress? How do I stay emotionally regulated? So you're probably doing lots of great stuff. So we'll start there. What are you doing well? But then is there something you'd like to try? Maybe you want to try some low-impact disclosure and do a bit of research on what that looks like, or tinker with it, or be more self-aware as you're sharing about your day. How do you maintain wellness? So this is going back to that self-care assessment or the ProQual, and actually saying, where do I maybe want to put focus or continue to focus my energy? How do you cope in an emergency? And by emergency, I mean sort of there's like day-to-day maintenance self-care, and then there's emergency, like the wheels have gone off or the train has left the track and I'm not okay. And so one of the things I often chat about with folks when we discuss emergency coping is looking at things like, who can you call if you're going home to a quiet house and you've had the worst day or the worst week, or maybe your manager called you in and gave you a chat about your behavior, your performance, your coping, your sick time, whatever it is, and it's really triggered you. How do you cope? Who do you call? Maybe who do you not call? And I think sometimes that's as important a conversation to have. And who you call might be a best friend or a sister or a mom or a dad, can also be a counselor, a crisis line, a variety of other supports, right? Maybe it's a pastor, a cultural advisor, an elder. So really looking at, when you really need some intensive support right now, think about it when you're okay, right? It's easier than when you're struggling. And this may sound familiar because these are probably similar to words you've told people you're supporting, clients, family members, so on. But how do we apply that to ourselves? And how do we focus in on one little thing we could do in the next few days by next Tuesday, say in the next week or less? What can we do in a bit longer stretch, or what can we do in the next month? Because I think the other piece is we often have great intentions and say, oh, I really want to do this. For me, it's I really need to get back to the pool. I love swimming. I feel so good when I'm in the water. It's almost meditative for me when I swim. And so I've had a plan for months. So now whenever I think about I need to get back to the pool, it's not self-care, it's self-flagellation, because I haven't done it, and, you know, what are my excuses, and why haven't I made it happen, and why haven't I prioritized myself? And so what are the things you can pick that you can reasonably accomplish? So the reason for this, sometimes with our self-care, we do exactly the same as what's happening in our workplace, right? Is we have a disconnect between expectations and reality. So how do we bring those things closer to alignment so that what's realistic is what's expected, right? And that often moves us into the area of self-compassion and seeing ourselves with softness and gentleness and giving ourselves permission to be human and do the best we can every single day. So low-impact disclosure is certainly important, as is emotional regulation and self-care. The other piece I haven't talked as much about is that vulnerability, which can increase our risk of compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and so on, also, though, can be a strategy for resilience. And so that is the paradox of all of this, right? That often I think when people have experienced emotional vulnerability that then for them is connected to an experience of trauma, it becomes, well, then I'm not going to do that again because that's not safe. And the reality is that ongoing willingness to show up and be vulnerable, to engage in self-assessment, to be sort of connected in a meaningful way to supervision is so essential to staying well, but also to being able to reinvest in the work. And so as much as it seems a bit counterintuitive, it's really crucial that we don't shut down and disengage for the long term. It may be what we need to do in the short term to cope, but it's certainly something we need to find a way back into as we move forward into the work. So as promised, there's a few resources available at the end. Some good stuff on compassion fatigue. Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky's TED Talk, I use it all the time, and I encourage you to watch it. It's funny and heart-wrenching and really informative. It's about 17 minutes long, and you can watch little bits of it if you don't have 17 minutes in a stretch, but I encourage you to do that. And her website is traumastewardship.com. She also has a book called Trauma Stewardship, where she explores that trauma exposure response. And then Tend Academy is another website for helpers that looks at how we define and understand compassion fatigue. So it can be really helpful if you're trying to wrap your head around this and really do some self-reflection on what's going on. The other thing, just at the very end, is you are welcome to look me up, send me an email, and let me know if you have questions, if this resonated with you, if there's something missing. I love to hear from folks who've experienced these sessions that I do and really get some feedback, but also learn a bit more about the people who are out there, engaging in the work, and then how this resonates with what you've experienced. So on that note, thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck on your journey learning to fall.